from the computers that I'd used back in the 1980s because it was clear that the 1990s were not going to have anything to do with computers. And it was a modest idea, I thought, a study of 2 counties before, during, and after the Civil War, one in Virginia, one in Pennsylvania. And those places had seen a lot of war. I made sure of that when I chose them, but they were nothing special. Augusta County, Stanton, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, Chambersburg. And it was going to be a short book, unlike the one that I just finished, even though the purpose was to include all the people in those 2 counties, black and white, soldier and civilian, women and men, and to integrate all facets of the war that engulfed them: military history, political history, social history. And finally, I was going to try to do what a lot of books don't do, which is look before, during, and after the war. They tend to stop at Appomattox. They tend to start with Fort Sumter, and I just don't think that you can understand the war if we don't understand both its causes and its consequences. And I didn't want to just stack up topical chapters on this group or that group, but to show how every other part of the war made every other part. So I place it in the Great Valley because that promised to give coherence to the story as 2 places confronted the same events and challenges. Now, I could imagine this thing in 1991, 92, because one, I didn't really know much about the Civil War, even though I've been a professor at UVA for a long time. By that, I had never written. I'd written 2 books. Neither of them had the slightest word about the Civil War. And finally, after teaching for 20 years, the 19th century American South, I decided that I should confront the central event in American history. But I did it with the way that I got into history in the first place, which is to write a kind of history that includes everybody. And so I had to kind of get over an aversion to Civil War history, in fact, and to imagine that we could actually tell a story in a more capacious way than we had. Another reason that I took this on is I had no idea of how many stories I might be able to find in just 2 counties. I thought, how much could there be? Well, you've already heard from Sean, he's already kind of spilled the beans. There's this much. It's 1,000 pages if you add the 2 books together of just these 2 counties. Now, I do weave them into the larger story, but everything that's in these 2 books, we have evidence for in the Valley of the Shadow. Now, the main thing I wanted to do with the Valley of the Shadow is write a book because that's what historians do, and it's because all I knew how to do. But then through a series of accidents that I'll not drag you through right now, I came to imagine the book as a digital database that I would share with schools that want to let students explore history for themselves, to realize that history is not just that shrink-wrapped, double-columned, multiple choice stuff that we get students in schools, which led my mother, a 5th grade teacher, to tell me when I decided I was going to go to graduate school in history. She said, "What for, honey? We already know what happened." And that's the way that so many people think of history. And I was trying to show, no, not only do we not know what happened, but more importantly, the people in it did not know what was going to happen. So basically, my understanding of the Civil War is you have to forget that you have any idea in the next week. Then I imagined it something new. We began building this thing. And then one day my colleague called me and said, "Ed, you need to come down to my office. Here's something brand new called the World Wide Web." And so we built something. When you go onto the front page of the Valley of the Shadow, you'll see it begins 1993, which is 6 months after the World Wide Web was introduced. Anyway, actually I read, anyway. So then I imagined as a CD-ROM, which I thought was going to be the future of the digital world, and that didn't work out. And then it turned out that because the World Wide Web caught on, it's been used by many millions of people around the world, even though we hadn't completed it. So we have completed it now. And it turns out that probably Augusta County and Franklin County are the 2 most thoroughly documented counties in the United States, because I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to share my screen now. And this is always the exciting part. And tell me now, do you see the Valley of the Shadow? You do. So the basic idea here is it's every piece of information about every person who lived in these 2 counties. which meant, this is back in the early 90s, PDF files didn't exist. And so we had to figure out how you would show images of newspapers and letters and diaries. This is long before Ancestry or any of the genealogy tools. And so we had to figure out, we had to type in the entire population, agricultural, manufacturing, and slave owning censuses of 2 counties, 1860 and 1870. That's a lot of typing. There's about 40,000 people who live in Franklin County, about 25,000 people who lived in Augusta County. And plus every letter and diary that we could find, and it turned out there were very many, including the largest single collection of letters from a group of brothers who were soldiers in the United States colored troops, the largest single collection anywhere. And turns out that Franklin County is where Frederick Douglass met John Brown before Harper's Ferry. And it turns out that the only diary in the entire war where we have a diary of a soldier on the front lines and his wife on the home front, day by day. So I've just lucked out basically all this stuff. So I'll show you how it works. I thought we might dip into search the newspapers, and you can look at all this yourself. My friend Annie Evans will put things in chat, links for it. So I thought it might be good if we put in the name of your county and we search it. And we see there's 16 results for Fauquier County. And so the Franklin Repository is the Republican paper in the north. The Stanton Vindicator is the secessionist paper in Stanton. Which seems to be the main one. The Stanton Spectator is the Unionist paper in Stanton. And so it looks like more, and the Valley Spirit is the Democratic paper in Franklin County. So you got all 4 papers of varying degrees of politics talking about you folks. And to give you some sense of how this works, you'll see that the Stanton Vindicator criticizes one of your delegates, Mr. Marr, because he is what they call. So I was saying that the Stanton Vindicator, which is the strong secessionist newspaper, the former Democratic paper in Augusta County, is really disgusted with your delegate, Mr. Marr, who, along with Mr. Flournoy of Halifax, who were elected as union men.
Is there audio?
Who were looked on as submissionists. Now, what's a submissionist? A submissionist is someone who wants to submit to and save the United States. Is really what that means, that they are going to submit to Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. But it turns out that most of the delegates who went to Richmond, elected for the convention in 1861, were for the United States and would have been labeled by the secessionists as submissionists. Of course, they were labeled by themselves as people who were patriotic and trying to save the United States. So what's interesting is that when you read both of these books and look at the Valley of the Shadow, you'll see that pretty soon both the papers in Stanton become strongly pro-Confederate. What you'll see, on the other hand, is that the papers in Franklin County don't fall in line. The Democrats in the North resist Abraham Lincoln for his entire term. And here's an important thing to remember. Abraham Lincoln is able to persuade exactly 1% more Democrats to vote for him in 1864 than had in 1860, which means that 45% of white Northern men would not support Abraham Lincoln in 1864. So we're going to talk mainly about the South tonight, about Virginia, but it's important it's one advantage of seeing both stories in parallel, that you realize that, and we see today, that the 45% of people who didn't vote for President Biden haven't just sort of given up, right? They hold on to the beliefs they have. So this is the story in many ways of the Civil War as well. So that's one of the things you can do. You can go into the Valley of the Shadow and you can look at for inspiration, but also for direct connections. Sean and I were playing around a little bit before, and there's quite a bit about Warrenton, which obviously is actually, you folks were in the war more than Augusta County. Most of the time during the war, Augusta is just a pivot on the railroad where it connects to Richmond and then connects to the Valley. But then in 1864, it's invaded. probably know about the burning of the valley in 1864. Chambersburg, on the other end of I-81 there, is invaded by the Confederates twice, or actually 3 times. They came in once in 62. They camped out there in 63 for Gettysburg, and then they came in and burned it to the ground in 1864. So through all those events, you're able to see quite a bit. When you go back and look at those other articles about Fauquier, you'll see that it goes all the way from the moments before secession until after the war, in which there is a Black man who is a part of a delegation to go visit President Andrew Johnson after the war. So if you'd imagine how much changes in the course of the war that rapidly, that in 1860, 48.9% of the population in Fauquier is Black and enslaved, nearly half the population. By 1866, so 6 years later, that system of slavery is abolished, and one of those men shakes the hand of the President of the United States. Now, as it turns out, the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, is quite rude to them and dismisses them, but it gives you still a sense of how it goes. So you can look for all those things in your own, when you have a moment to do so. So I started writing this book, and keeping with the 23rd Psalm theme established by the Valley reference, I called it In the Presence of Mine Enemies. And it turned out that I lucked out in the choice of my counties. I said I found all this remarkable stuff, including in Augusta County. The map maker to the Confederacy, Jedediah Hotchkiss, who had just moved down from New York State about 5 years before the war and ends up being the map maker for Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. And the fact, as you can see here, we have 2 newspapers all the way through the war. So it's like having both MSNBC and Fox News the whole time. I'm able to see the range of opinion that people have and all that. So I decided that this could only be told as a story. And because a story can explain things that just statements and analysis cannot. Because stories embody the central traits of history, which are change, conflict, complexity, contingency, in ways that we can't otherwise. So when we watch the people of the North and the South interacting, you see how much they're making each other's history, but we're also seeing how Black and white people are making each other's history, how much women are making the history of the men in the field. And we realize that history that tries to take history apart and just deal with one part of it is never really going to be able to explain what it's trying to explain. Now, one reason I want young people to be able to look into all this archive is they have a hard time believing, partly because we've told them that this is the case, that none of this is preordained. When I talk with teachers and students, I ask them how many have chapter graphs in their textbooks that show how much more stuff the United States had than the Confederacy. And they all do. And the clear implication of that is that the North is going to win, or the United States, as I think it's better to call it than the North, because it had more stuff. But on the other hand, the Confederacy owned the playing field and controlled all of that. Plus, they had 4 million people that they could deploy as they sought to do. So one of the main themes of the book is that every single stage of this is a surprise. Nobody expected anything like a civil war that kills the equivalent today of 8 million people, if we'd had it, and ends the largest, most powerful system of slavery in the modern world overnight. That was unimaginable because it was impossible. It just happened to have happened. We need to get over all that, this idea. And a crusade that I'm on now is one of the most stubborn mythologies of the Civil War, is that it was about the industrial North and the agrarian South. No, it wasn't. The North is 75% agrarian at the time of the Civil War. And what's agrarian mean in the South? It means agribusiness through forced labor. It's not agriculture like Pepperidge Farm or something, right? And it's also the case that the war is not really modern. It has railroads, but it also moving most stuff by mule. And without refrigeration means you're marching huge herds of pigs and horse and cattle with you to feed yourself. So we kind of get over this idea that it's really a modern war. It's actually pretty crude in many ways. So as I tried to put the story together and tried to figure out things, I realized that at every stage, people acted in ways that made perfect sense to them. And our job was to recover the logic by which they would do this. Because looking back on it, we can see that secession proved to be the worst thing that Southern slaveholders could possibly have done. We'll talk about that just a little bit more. So part of what we did is to recover, as we're going to talk about tonight, more of the coming in the early days of the war. So I want to share with you another site, and this will be in the chat. So back when we're in the sesquicentennial of the war, at University of Richmond, we made this site, which we transcribed the 3,500 pages of the debates over secession in Richmond, so that people could actually see how it was that the largest slave state, people tend to forget that, there are more enslaved people in Virginia than there are in any other state in the South. But the state that had created large parts of America with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and that resisted secession over and over again, ended up seceding. If Virginia doesn't secede, the Civil War as we know it doesn't happen. If Virginia doesn't secede, emancipation as we know it doesn't happen. So places like Fauquier, Augusta, the whole valley and everything to the west, I mean, you need to remember, of course, that what we now call West Virginia is a part of Virginia at the time. So one of the things that we can do is that we can search and see what your own delegates had to say, which I just happened to have done earlier today. So I know that they say interesting things. And so you'll see there that your delegate's Robert Scott, and you can see this starts in February of 1861. So Virginia says, we're not going to be like South Carolina or Georgia, where they just secede with the guys who happen to be hanging around the state capitol. We're the mother of democracy. We're going to have a convention made up of people from every county in the Commonwealth, elected by the citizens of the Commonwealth. And one reason they do that is they are pretty sure that's going to save the United States. They believe that when they elect these delegates, and the great majority of them are against secession when they come to Richmond, that they are going to find a way to mollify the North and the South and to persuade their fellow slave states not to secede. And much of the debate is about that. So if we look at April 3rd, there's even more of these than I remember. Look how many quotes that you have from your delegate. I will actually, let me go here. See if this gives me what I'm looking for. Yeah, so here are the 10 quotes. So in April 3rd, he says, I'm all for the Union. All we have to have is an amendment to the Constitution that protects slavery forever, and we're good. And he says, surely the United States will give us that. So that is the position of Fauquier's delegate, Robert Scott, he's a leader in that argument. Then in April 10, that doesn't work. April 10th, a week later, he says, no, here's what we need to do. We need to have a convention of all the border states, by which they mean Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, that are not in the Confederacy at this time. We will come together, and then we'll save the United States, and with Virginia in the lead. Because it's certainly true that North Carolina and Tennessee and Kentucky are waiting to see what Virginia does. So we need to remember how long secession takes, that Richmond is filled with basically lobbyists from South Carolina and other parts of the Confederacy coming up and trying to persuade Virginia to secede. And over again, they write home and say, Virginia's not going to do anything until she's forced. Virginia is, and meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln saying, why are you sitting there? It's like a cocked gun having this convention that you could decide tomorrow at any time to secede. So nobody's really happy about this. Meanwhile, crowds outside of the meeting hall in Richmond are burning bonfires, calling the delegates grandmas for refusing to go ahead and be real men and secede. So they're pushing. Young men are more in favor of secession than young men. And so you can see that if we look by, let's see, go back. So you can look at data visualizations of this, and you can see votes for secession by county. So this is April 4th, and areas that are blue are for the United States. And I believe you will see Fauquier there in blue, right? April 17th, look at that. That's what changes, right? Now you see why West Virginia is West Virginia, but you also see how many counties close to Fauquier, right over the Blue Ridge there, are vote against secession even when they begin. And ironically, Augusta County where is Augusta? Is it there? Yeah, somebody, here it is. There's somebody who spent all this time in Augusta County, think I'd be able to put my finger right on it, but where is it? I've gone too far, way too far. I was thrown off by West Virginia. So Augusta County votes to stay in the Union. Ironically, the place that's commits so many soldiers to the Confederacy, and including so many of the soldiers who fought with Stonewall Jackson, vote against secession. So this is an important thing for us to remember, is that it took a long time for Virginia to figure out that it was going to secede, and even when it did, large parts of the state did not go with it. So when you go back and look at this and you read what your delegate says, he says, this breaks my heart, but we're going to have to stick together. And they secede. And so what you find is a lot of the men who voted against secession vote for Union and then become completely dedicated to the Confederacy in a week. In a week. So that's a remarkable story, which I think is, I'm not sure we really wrapped our minds around. And so I read all this, and then I wrote this book. I actually went to California at Stanford, sat down and wrote 150 pages and decided it was wrong, that I wasn't going to be able to write it that way. So I started all over again. I came back to Charlottesville, and then they made me Dean of Arts and Sciences right before this book came out. And so I wasn't able to finish volume 2. And this goes up to the day before Gettysburg, and looks for all the world like the Confederacy is going to win. And Robert E. Lee writes his wife, we're going to give them a defeat, and it's going to, and here's the key to the whole Civil War, it's going to persuade them to vote against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, and then they will end the war. So we have this fantasy of Gettysburg's the turning point of the war and all that sort of. No, it's not. The election of 1864 is the only turning point in the war. And you need to remember, if 60,000 votes had gone differently, Abraham Lincoln would not have been president of the United States in 1864. And George McClellan was already on record. Enough men had died. It's time to put the United States back together. Let's figure out what we can do with slavery, but we're not going to destroy it, okay? That's how much in the air all those things were. So then I was eager to write volume 2 after I was through being dean, but then I ended up becoming president of the University of Richmond. And I'm telling you, it's hard to write a book sitting in LaGuardia Airport or going to cocktail parties, which is kind of what I did for 8 years. So finally, volume 2 came out in 2015, and the reviews used euphemisms like long awaited, or my favorite, even eagerly awaited, which is a lot better than inexcusably delayed or way overdue. But the two stories go together, they tell the story, and it goes all the way up through the 15th Amendment. So you put the two stories together and you go from John Brown's raid to the 15th Amendment, all of which takes less than a decade. Well, actually it takes 12 years, okay? So what I want to talk about then is this. Since I began this, of course, there's been a revolution in digital. When this began, this was all very bold, but now you're used to it. Here we are talking to each other, doing a lecture in Zoom, which many of us had not really used about a year ago, and now we're coming together about it. But now the historical world is saturated with the digital. I'll tell you a brief story. I got an invitation to write a book about a grave, Civil War graves. And I said, well, that's interesting because I have a grave site from the home where I'm from, way up in the mountains of North Carolina, which should have been Unionist by all our calculations, what Appalachia was like. But my ancestors, I knew from a plastic flag that the Sons of Confederate Veterans had put on the grave one time, was for the Confederacy. And so it turned out that I'd had an uncle of some sort who'd been a member of the Home Guard. And he traveled all the way from Western North Carolina to Saltville, Virginia, through treacherous East Tennessee, filled with every kind of bushwhacker and Unionist who would be out to get Confederates, to bring salt back for his community. And so I said, yeah, I'd like to know more about him. I looked into a little bit more, and I saw that I had another ancestor from the same county who had been killed at Mechanicsville in the 7 Days Battle at the very beginning of the Civil War. So I said, what I'd like to do is to talk about that young man, and I could do all the research and show you how you would discover this about this long lost relative. And the editor of this book wrote me back in 10 minutes. He said, well, I found your relative on Ancestry, and there's a picture of a man standing next to his grave in Oakwood Cemetery. So in 10 minutes, the research that I had imagined being an adventure had already come and gone. So that just shows you how the study of history has been revolutionized since the early 1990s, when the Valley of the Shadow was in American Heritage, it was in the New York Times, that as a big deal, that we were going to put history on the internet. So we're getting ready to rebuild the Valley of the Shadow so that you can see it on your phones and things. But in the meantime, as Sean mentioned, we started something called New American History. And I won't go into all the different parts of it, but it's really cool, and you can see it. Annie's going to give you links to it. But I thought that if you were interested in learning more, say, about secession, what we're talking about tonight, you would spell it right first, and then you would hit secession, and you would see that there are 67 articles that are in current newspapers, magazines, and blogs about secession. And you can see everything about mail delivery and the experience of disunion, the recent inaugurations that we have, women's magazines that tried to stop the Civil War. So if you go to bunkhistory.org, we're harvesting now enormous amounts of every day of the way that people are using history to explain today. So I tell you all this to show you how things have changed from the day where we had to type in the entire manuscript census to today, when we can harvest all these articles and share them with you instantly. And this is all for free. You know, I mean, the whole idea is that we're working with schools and trying to share it so that young people will actually be interested in history earlier than they would have been before. So I've been trying to, I'll end by trying to say what I've been trying to do. Is trying to explain secession. That's what volume 1 about. Volume 2 is really about the largest experiment in democracy in American history that we call Reconstruction. So what is it? If we follow the story of secession, as we've glimpsed here, from one step to another, until the minute it happened, nobody expected the United States to be broken in two. And matter of fact, it was that very lack of expectation that allowed it to happen. Because people kept saying, well, we'll just bluff them with this. We'll just say this. Yeah, well, you do this, we'll do that. And Americans talked themselves into the Civil War. There's no reason for the Civil War to happen in 1861. There's no material conflict. Americans talked themselves into it. And the other thing I'd want to show is that it was not that conflict over slavery was unavoidable. It's not that it was avoidable or needless, but the conflict did not have to follow the particular course it did. And it followed the particular course it did precisely because slavery was so entwined with everything in the United States. Now, in our textbooks, slavery is often put off in a separate chapter. It's considered to be, African-American history. It gets February to talk about it or whatever. But the fact is that It's the largest economic interest in the United States. The enslaved population of the South was worth more than all the railroads and banks and factories of the North combined. It counted for the great majority of the economic power of the United States. And it was entwined with all the banks and insurance companies and big universities of the North, all those things. Slavery was entangled everywhere. So I really resist, and one thing that I say is wherever I'm invited to speak, I try to annoy the people who are kind enough to invite me. So when I go to the North, I really push on that, or when I go to the West and have people get over themselves. But when I'm talking with fellow Southerners, I say, yeah, let's look this straight in the face. This is not states' rights. This is not the Constitution. This is about, as you'll see when you look at the things that your delegate said, it's about slavery. So the thing to do is to give credit to the minority of white Northerners who advocated for freedom and union. It's not because they were modern or industrial, it's because they were brave and even foolhardy to do this. And Republicans, the Republican Party, especially Abraham Lincoln, deserve enormous credit for persuading enough of the white North to continue fighting for a war that was being fought for a purpose they did not begin. The United States does not go to war to end slavery because that's impossible. They go to war to stop its spread. But then over the course of the war, that what you see, of course, is Lincoln expands the purpose of the war, not only to save the United States, but to end slavery. That required, his great accomplishment was persuading enough white Northerners to go along with him. What does that mean? That means put another son at risk. Leave your father in the field for another year. It's asking more than any president's ever asked of anybody in the United States. And so that was actually the accomplishment for doing all that. So, you know, by looking at the border between the North and the South, between the United States and Confederacy, where hard decisions had to be made by enslaved people and their captors every day, we could see how much violence, law, power, and injustice held slavery in place close to its edge. And when I first began, some historians say, well, are you trying to downplay the role of slavery by looking at Virginia? You know, why don't you look at where it was really important, like South Carolina, Mississippi? I said, well, Virginia's still the largest slave state. And what you'll see, and Fauquier County is a good example of this, nearly half enslaved. Today, people would think of it as greater Northern Virginia, perhaps. You know, you're at the intersection points of lots of different parts, right? And people, it always seems jarring even now when you see the Army of Northern Virginia, which you kind of picture them on the interstates or the beltways or whatever, you know. But slavery was slavery all the way up to the northern border. As far as slavery could extend, it did. It was not diluted. And so that's how you can explain how it would be that Virginia would eventually decide that it had to go with the Confederacy. It's not soil, it's not crops, it's not weather, it's not cities, it's not industry, it's not culture, it's not religion, because all those things are the same. The whole idea of this came when I was driving up I-81, and I said, Pennsylvania looks exactly like Virginia. This is the same place. How could they go to war with each other and kill each other in just a matter of weeks? It's a mystery that we do well to recover. So if you put all these different pieces together, you can see how everything's connected, how quickly people could change their minds. And then when people changed their minds, their hearts followed. And then precisely because Virginia went into the Confederacy reluctantly, it told itself ever since that it must be because it was high purpose, high moral purpose, because it did not serve its interest. And Robert E. Lee embodies that. His own reluctance is seen as his high-mindedness, rather than it being a really hard decision to make. So everything about the Civil War is more complicated than we think, which means it's more interesting than its things. But here's one way to think about it. How do we have this impossible thing happen? It's because the opponents of it happening made it happen. The only way slavery could possibly have come to an end is if the slaveholding states had left the United States. because otherwise they were protected by the Constitution. They could have had slavery for generations more. They could not have expanded it, but they could have kept it. The only thing that could put it at risk was removing the constitutional protection by going to war. Then what you find is that the Confederacy had not fought so effectively for so long, slavery would not have come to an end. If Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had allowed Richmond to fall in 1862, slavery would not have ended. It took all the suffering of the war, and finally, the same white Northerners who said, we resent the fact that this war has had its purpose extended to embrace emancipation, then said, but we're not going to give up now. We're this close. And you can actually watch men change their minds and say, yes, we're going to fight for the end of slavery. So the Confederacy causes emancipation by seceding, then it enables emancipation by fighting so effectively, and then in Reconstruction, it brings on the 14th and 15th Amendment by resisting it so long. And because imagine how tired the people of the United States are fighting the South, and how tired many of them are fighting for Black people. Okay? The North is just as racist as can be, right? But the white South refused to accept even a modicum of freedom for the enslaved people, and it pushed the North into Reconstruction. As one Republican paper put it, the white South had committed, quote, the colossal suicide of world history. But other losers shaped the story as well. Northern Democrats opposed the Republicans so tenaciously at every step during and after the war that the Republicans strengthened their support for emancipation, and then for the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. Perhaps you've seen the Lincoln movie, and it seems like a strange thing to focus on at the end of the war. Why would they do this? It's because Lincoln knows if he doesn't get the 13th Amendment in place, slavery could kind of reestablish itself. Then after he's assassinated, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and others come to realize that the South is filled with what they call rebelism. That the white South is unrepentant. They say you beat us because you have more stuff, more men, as Robert E. Lee says at Appomattox. But we were not wrong. Slavery is over by force of arms, but we will maintain control. And we have nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. So you see what people are talking about today with the lost cause begins almost immediately. So, and finally, the most powerless people in America, the people who've been held in slavery for over 250 years, played the other critical role. They drove toward emancipation from the first days of the war. Within 2 weeks of Virginia seceding, they go to Fort Monroe and declare themselves on the side of the United States. After 2 centuries, in 2 weeks, they go to the United States because they finally have an ally. And they fought all the way through the war, 200,000 men, more than all the soldiers at Gettysburg. Black men fought for the United States. And then they fought and helped write a new constitution for Virginia with the radical idea of creating the first public school system in the state during Reconstruction. So what you see looking back on all this is that we need to set aside our certainties, our formulas, to actually look at this record, and we try to show it to you in fullness in the valley of the shadow, so that you can see how it is that history is like the present. We don't know what's going to happen. Every day kind of resets the table. We have to recalculate who exactly are we, what do we believe in, what are we going to do now? We've seen in recent events, the COVID crisis, the elections, all these different kind of things. It's important for our students to understand, and for us to understand, that the past was like that as well. It was not on a railroad leading to us, and not necessarily leading to progress. Now, when I took on this project, I just finished a book that ended in the early 20th century, and my friends were surprised. What, you're going to go back and do the 19th century? You're going to go back in time? I said, yeah. Until we figure out the Civil War, we're not going to figure it out ourselves. It's just turned out the last few years, unfortunately, have shown us how right that is. We're still wrestling with the flags, the monuments, the words, the men associated with it. And what it means is until we figure out the Civil War, we're going to have a hard time figuring out today. So that's why I appreciate you folks willing to come out and give us an hour on a Saturday evening. I'm glad it's dark at least, so there's nothing else you could be doing outside. But I wanted to, you can't possibly have believed all that. So Sean's going to ask me some questions that he's seeing, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, folks. So if you have questions, like I said at the beginning, you can put them in the chat. I'm also going to say that you can come off of mic, make a sound to let us know that you're interested, or I'll kind of be flitting through the videos to see if there's anybody sort of overtly saying that they have something. And then, of course, I've got questions myself that I'll ask if we don't get any right away. So you've got some time to think about them. So actually, I'll go ahead and ask that first one, Dr. Ayers.
Okay.
So in The Presence of Mine Enemies, you talk a lot. We kind of come to the point in Augusta and Franklin, and you definitely talked about it in this talk, but I want to hone down on it.
Sure.
You mentioned how it's 2 weeks. It's just a 2-week period between both counties being very anti-war, very unionist on both sides, trying to figure something out, and then just kind of throwing themselves into the war. And I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more to like that sort of crazy martial spirit that took over both counties, the idea that they I think you said that there was a language that was deeper than the Constitution, that like everybody just knew the words to say in this moment, and all the people who were angry at each other within the county kind of came together in opposition to the other side, and then threw themselves into war. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that, because it's such a crazy phenomenon.
Yeah, and yet it's a familiar phenomenon, right? That what people want is solidarity. You will stand by your neighbor. And that becomes part, and it's true that people were fighting for their homes, which is a part of the language that many people who defend the Confederacy today say they were just fighting for their homes because they were being invaded. And that is certainly the way they understood it. Now, it's also the fact that often when I'm giving talks, people will say, well, Dr. Ayers, the rest of the South wasn't like Fauquier. It wasn't nearly half enslaved. It was only a quarter enslaved, and 3/4 of white men did not own enslaved people, so they could not have been fighting for slavery. Well, first of all, every military-age white man who could fight did. So it's not like this is that movie Shenandoah, where it's like all these strapping young guys just said, "You're going to set out the war." Well, they couldn't have done that, right? So it's also the draft in the North as well, and so it's kind of breathing down your neck. Plus, as I sometimes say to college students, if you ever want another date, you better get in line, because if you'll be seen as a coward, you'll be seen as disloyal to your own community. Now, a much larger share of the men in Augusta County fight than in the northern county. And that's true in general. The North does have a lot more men. So what it means is that virtually every able-bodied man in Augusta County fought, whereas only about half the men in Franklin County fought. So you've got, first of all, just that peer pressure. And you need to remember, most of these people are somewhere between 19 and 24 years old, right? So they have lives to make, and they want to be men. They've never had a chance to prove themselves of that before. And it's also the case that they believe in what they're fighting for, but they've been translated. If you look at the posters that they put up in Augusta County, it says, "Your abolitionist foes are coming to invade," right? So they're not saying, men who voted differently from you and have a different idea of what the Constitution says, they're saying your abolitionist foes are coming to attack. What do they say in the North? They're saying, they're not really emphasizing so much the slaveholding of the South. They're saying these rebels who are trying to destroy the United States need to be put down. The big mistake that Abraham Lincoln makes is an entirely understandable one. He can't imagine that all white Southerners are going to support the Confederacy. 2 weeks before, there's no indication of that. He can't believe that all the men who voted for the Unionist candidates before are just going to decide to vote for to fight and die for the Confederacy. He keeps thinking, okay, we'll be gentle in some ways for as long as we can to give them a chance to rise up. And this seems ironic, knowing how the story turned out. His ideal is Andrew Johnson, of East Tennessee, where I'm from, is that he refuses to lead the Senate when the rest of the white South does. He's the wartime governor of Tennessee. He's brave, and he says there's got to be a lot of other non-slaveholding whites who love the United States more than they do this brand new would-be Confederacy. He always calls it the would-be Confederacy or the so-called Confederacy. He refuses to acknowledge that it's actually legitimate. So you have everything from just that kind of tribal, I mean, we see how people can get at a ball game, right? Yeah, that same sense of identity with one another. But you're also go to church and you're having your minister say, this is what God wants, you know, that we're blessed. You notice how the Confederacy is very proud of the Christian nature of its leading generals and so forth, right? They believe that they're on the side of justice because they are protecting the people in slavery. They're Christianizing them. The people in the North, of course, feel just contrary. So what you see, Sean, is all these different things, whether it's political or economic or gender, manliness or religion, suddenly they all click into place. The big value all along is loyalty. But loyalty shifts in one big piece in the Confederacy. You have been loyal to your community and to your state, but when your state leaves, now you're loyal to the state, but disloyal to the United States. So it's complicated. But so thanks for asking me that really hard question, but we'll pretend I answered it.
I think that's one of the best parts of the book for anybody who gets a chance to read it, is that when you do a study on a small area so thoroughly, the social, the political, the economic pressures that an individual felt during a conflict like that come through so clearly. It's really amazing, guys. So if you haven't read the book, that's one of the best parts of it, is that you really understand what was facing an individual in a conflict like that and who didn't know what was happening. Just like you said, nobody knew what was going to happen. It didn't have to happen the way it did.
One of the things I want to be sure to emphasize, I have kind of a jocular tone sometimes, but I'm not setting a moral judgment of these people, right? In fact, I'm trying to show how it would be that these good people, you read their letters and their diaries, you often feel for them, you know? How could they do this? And so we begin with respect and assume that it's up to us to figure out why they were doing it, not writing this off as, oh, they were crazy, there was bloodlust, you know? It's like Gone with the Wind, they were all just kind of show off for Scarlet. No. They had their reasons. They could explain why they were doing. It just turned out to be the biggest mistake that white Southerners made. They lost a quarter of their military-age white men for a cause that they lost, that they didn't have to fight. So trying to explain, and then the irrationality, why would the North fight for something that they'd shown no indication whatsoever before of wanting to end slavery, and they end up doing that. So the whole thing is a mystery. It's like a mystery novel that we try to solve. Okay, ask me another question.
Cindy has a question that says,
okay.
In other countries, are there any striking parallels to the U.S. Civil War, especially to the entrenched, long-lasting, lost cause mentality? Is our Civil War unique or often replicated elsewhere? That's a very interesting question.
That's a great question. I can see Cindy that she's near me, so thanks for smiling. People, especially in recent years, as we've been debating the fate of the monuments and of the flags, I've had calls from Germany and England and France and Spain trying to figure out what's going on, because in those places the losing sides have been discredited, and you know it's illegal. You're not going to see any symbols of the Nazi regime in Germany. It's illegal, right? And so I think the United States is unusual in not only tolerating, but in some ways fostering respect for the losing side. And that was pretty much unchallenged for at least 100 years after the Civil War. The basic deal was the North got to run the country and the South could run itself, especially race relations. And the North said, go ahead and put up your statues, have your reunions, you know, let the fallen heroes of the Confederacy be your heroes. We don't respect that, but it's not taking anything from us, right? Who it did take things from, of course, are Black Southerners. And what it means that white Southerners completely controlled the public spaces of the South. And of course, a large part of controlling the public spaces ended up being what we call segregation, right? I grew up in the segregated South, so I know what this looks like. White and colored signs, that, you know, and in many ways, this was white Southerners staking out public spaces and saying these belong to us. And so the United States is unusual in not only tolerating that, but you'll see there's a lot more. In some ways, if you just visit the United States today and see where there's Confederate flags, it looks like the Confederacy is larger than it actually was. And go into West Virginia and see how many Confederate flags there are.
Yeah.
And there are, or my hometown, which says East Tennessee, they created a new high school in the southern part of the county in the 1970s. So it became Sullivan South. Instead of having a prom, they have a plantation ball. And this is a place that's 95% white. And their nickname were the Rebels. That's as late as the 1970s. That kind of goes along, we know, with Leonard Skinner and sort of, you know, Southern rock and all that. So it's been, the Confederacy has become equated with people who are in opposition to lots of different things. It basically means don't tell me what to think. Don't be so-called politically correct. And so I think that but you see Confederate flags flying on United States tanks in World War II. There are still National Guard units that have Confederate units on their patches. So the United States is quite unusual in this regard, Cindy. So thanks, that's a good question. Not gonna look you in the eye when I answer that. All right.
Yeah, we appreciate those who chose to go on video. Thank you for that, guys. So Cindy actually has another good question.
Okay.
So, you know, we focused, rightfully so, mostly on Virginia because of course Fauquier County is in Virginia, and that's the part that I really wanted to hone down on. But she does ask, and because, you know, the book also deals in Franklin County in Pennsylvania, very interestingly, she wonders what were the largest reasons that Northern men enlisted in the Union Army, and you can focus on what you found about Franklin County in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, so Franklin County votes exactly the same way that the United States does. Very conveniently for me. I'm not sure I knew that when I chose it. And Franklin County, of course, is right on the Mason-Dixon line, right? And so that's another example. Just like the South is not watered down by being close to the border, neither is the North. So they're as firmly Republican as New England. Their story is simpler. We're trying to save the United States from people who have illegitimately taken control of our forts, Fort Sumter, and who have illegitimately taken control of the governments of the southern states. They just refuse to believe, like Lincoln, that most white Southerners would agree with this. And so that's how Lincoln is able to get such a huge upsurge of Democrats and Republicans, because they all want to save the United States. Democrats make a big point in the North. We have nothing against the white South. We have nothing against slavery. We don't want Black people here either, but we must keep the United States from breaking apart and becoming like Europe, from balkanizing, breaking apart. And so the story is pretty, which is why it's about Fort Sumter. It's about maintaining the integrity. Lincoln took an oath to protect the United States, and if you can't protect your own forts, you're not protecting your country, right? So that's how it begins. They do not begin to end slavery. I sometimes tell students, the Civil War is an unbalanced equation. The white South does go to war to protect its constitutional right, as it sees it, to extend slavery. But the North does not go to war to end slavery. It goes to the war to save the United States, in which slavery is a part. And then it's the story over the course of the war of how it is that the United States mobilizes. Thank you for that question too, Cindy.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end, but I have a question that I definitely want to ask, and then I think Cindy has a last really good one here.
All right, she's tough.
Yes, Cindy with all the questions. Thank you so much, Cindy. If anybody else has one, I'm going to ask mine, and this is your time to throw another one in there. But otherwise, we'll finish with these last two. So, Dr. Ayers, in the book, and we've definitely talked about it, but contingency plays a really big part in what you talk about, right?
Yep.
And you use the term, this is something that came, the reason why I want to ask this is this came up in the grad class that we, where I first read this book. You use the term deep contingency in the book. And I have to think you get asked this a lot, but we sort of went back and forth about what does deep contingency mean? What is the definition of deep contingency? And I always thought to myself, if I had the opportunity to ask you this, that I would do so. So here I am, and I wonder if you could help us with that definition.
Or you might ask, why the heck weren't you clear about that? If that's
No.
so, people today, the idea of contingency has become a kind of cliche in history. By contingency, we usually mean accident. You know, oh, this is just, oh, if that hadn't happened, if they hadn't lost the cigars with the orders wrapped around them at Antietam, you know, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, what does contingent actually mean? It means connected. Everything is connected to everything else. And so one example that I use, you'll notice that the 23rd Psalm, the Valley of the Shadow, all the parts of the book are named after that. It's because both sides believed that God was on their side. They believed that they were they're basically, everyone's Christian. The clearest example of deep contingency is in 2 weeks, they persuade themselves that they have God's sanction. That before they thought that God's sanction said to protect the United States, and then later they thought it said leave the United States, right? So, but by believing that, then that gives them resolve that feeds back into military resolve, right? And all these things. So it's a way of everything is connected. If you understand contingency in that way, you see that's what the whole book is about. It's how, well, this happens over here, and it's like a spider web. It's connected to this, and it happens. So that's my whole point. But the point is that what's the most deeply contingent thing that happens? The largest system of slavery in the modern world ends in 4 years. Why? Contingency of war, right? So it's the connection among all those things, and it's deep because it's the fundamental understanding of who people are. So go back, write an email to all your friends in graduate school and tell them that Ayers explained that to you, and it's completely persuasive.
I plan to. You'll be happy to know that we got pretty close to, I think, that definition, but hearing it from you, yeah, that's kind of what we landed on. But hearing it from you was really great right there. Thank you so much for that.
I only have several million more historians to persuade, and I'm all
all right, let's finish. Kim has one. This is great. So thank you, Kim. Lincoln won the 1860 election with only 39.4% of the vote. Did his efforts at winning actually lead to the Civil War? Despite his efforts to save it, did his efforts actually lead to the war? Interesting question.
Yeah, Lincoln's election is the trigger that begins the sequence of events that comes to the Civil War, okay? Without that, nothing else happens. Ironically, you'll notice that all the Deep South secedes before he takes office, because two terrible things might happen once he does. One, he might do something, or two, he might not. If he didn't do anything, the people who wanted to create a separate nation, which was the 4th largest economy in the world by itself, with the ability to expand into Cuba and maybe Mexico, they didn't want to let this moment pass. So they seized on that. I mean, their concern was genuine. They're not faking. But when Lincoln takes office, people know some of the speeches, you know, the better angels of our natures, in your hands, not mine, lie the future of the nation and all that. He hoped that Virginia would save the United States, right? And people thought that it would. What triggers it? The firing on Fort Sumter. So some people would say, well, Lincoln, if he hadn't tried to fortify the fort at Fort Sumter, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. Well, A, the men were running out of food, and B, if he allows that fort to fall, he's basically abandoned his oath of office in his first few months. So he has to do that. Then people say, and this is, if you go back and look at the site that I showed you about secession, this is true. What is the event that leads finally to Virginia Unionists to vote for secession? It's when Lincoln says, you must give me troops to help put down this illegal rebellion in South Carolina. So Virginia has no choice. Do we support the United States or our sister slave states, as they say? And we saw very many counties say we support the United States, but others say we can't lend, and they do believe it's constitutionally wrong. I mean, it's not that all that's a smoke front, and they do believe that the rights of the states to control their domestic institutions, the euphemism for slavery. So it depends. It goes back to Sean's question about contingency, right? How far back do we trace the thread, right? You could say, you know, this goes all the way back to the Constitution or the Missouri Compromise, but I'm showing as late as 1860 that there's the Civil War as it comes to pass is not inevitable. So to answer your question, Kim, the election of a Republican, Lincoln or whoever it was, with no votes basically from the South, was the precipitating event of a secession of which many white Southerners had long dreamed. But to go from there to the war required lots of steps in between, lots of other decisions, most of which were not Lincoln's. So, you know, who caused the Civil War? You know, it's be better to ask another question. How did the Civil War come to pass? How did it come to be? Because it took, Americans voted themselves into the Civil War, okay? This is not a coup. This grew out of democratic politics and a refusal to accept the result of an election, which they believed was illegal, even though it was not. They could have voted for Lincoln if they wanted to, right? So it's complicated, and I'll just end with this, Sean. I find that people from all different kinds of political perspectives want to have formulas, often that would fit on a bumper sticker to explain some of this stuff. It was just economics, or it was just states' rights, or it was just slavery. Any word that begins with just for something explaining this complexity and this awesome consequence is inadequate. My major approach to the Civil War is with awe and humility and empathy, because it's only if we do that can we understand how people who lived on the very landscape that we live on today made the decisions they did and had the consequences they did.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Ayers, for giving us your time so generously. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll clean up the video before I send it out, obviously. That's the first time that that's happened, but that's okay. I really, this was amazing. It's so appreciated.
Well, I'm honored that you've had me tonight, and I'm sure there's some basketball for some people to watch somewhere. And believe that you've got, mine's on record so I can see whatever happens. No, you just fast forward through all the free throws. It's much more efficient to record and watch it later. Anyway.
That's true. It's always better at the last half. Yeah.
But thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for caring about where you live. I think, you know, if we have more people care about the history of their own communities, we'd be a stronger place. So thanks for your work. Thank you, Sean. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.